Folks, thanks for coming along to our discussion tonight on Christianity and Australian Jurist with Chris Merritt, Justice Geoff Lindsay, Professor Wayne Hudson and Anne Henderson. I'll introduce them very briefly. It's on the occasion of the launch of this book, Australian Jurist and Christianity, published by the Federation Press, which has a number of chapters on prominent Australian jurists by a number of authors. And we've got three of the authors here tonight, and Chris Merritt's going to launch the book and introduce it. So Chris Merritt, as you know, is legal affairs columnist for The Australian, a central read every Friday, and vice president of the Rule of Law Institute of Australia. Justice Geoff Lindsay is Justice of the New South Wales Supreme Court, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of Law, and editor of the Australian Bar Review. Wayne Hudson is an author, an adjunct professor at Charles Sturt University and the Australian National University. And Anne Henderson, of course, is the Deputy Director here at the Sydney Institute. She's written biographies of Enid Lyons and a biography of Joseph Lyons, and the book Menzies at War, which essentially covers Robert Menzies in the period of the 1930s through to the 1940s, focusing particularly on his period as Prime Minister, 39 to 41. So we lead off with Chris, we go to Geoff, we go to Wayne, we go to Anne, we go to questions and discussion. Chris, thanks very much for doing this.
Quite okay, Gerard. It's a delight to launch this book. It's a terrific read and I highly recommend it. I want to start with an anecdote. 3 years ago, my friend Greg Sheridan invoked the wisdom of Monty Python to prove a point. The third chapter of Sheridan's book on Christianity uses a rhetorical device that is straight out of the life of Brian. This is what he said. What did we ever get from Christianity, apart from the idea of the individual, human rights, feminism, liberalism, modernity, social justice, and secular politics? His point was that it was ludicrous to deny the impact of Christian values on societies like ours. It's just as silly as trying to deny the impact of Shakespeare on the English language. It's part of who we are. For those who are unconvinced, take a look around. Australia today is bigger, richer, more complex than ever before. We're a multicultural, multiracial, and multi-religious society, yet we are bound together by an idea. This is the land of the fair go, and it is governed by the rule of law. So how did we get this way? In the ancient world, inequality was the dominant social structure. Some people were rightly born to be slaves, and others were rightly born to be slaveholders. Women, on the whole, were little more than chattels. Like the Americans, we inherited the rule of law from Britain, along with doctrines such as human rights and the innate value of individuals. But while the key concepts of the rule of law were identified by British thinkers such as A.V. Dicey, they are based on much older values. In his 2018 book, God is Good for You, Sheridan argues that almost all the assumptions we consider to be good in Western political culture come more or less directly from Christianity. That includes a secular polity in which church and state are separate, as well as what he refers to as an individual's large discretionary realm where government has no business interfering. His point is that even as we strive for the secular, broad Christian values such as fairness have informed our morality, and that in turn has shaped our civic culture. Different people will have different ideas about what fairness might require, but few would reject the concept of fairness itself. This helps explain why the rule of law is so entrenched in this country. Its key concepts, the presumption of innocence and equality before the law, are all about fairness. So it should come as no surprise that only a handful of countries hold the rule of law in higher regard. The World Justice Project's 2020 Rule of Law Index shows Australia ranks 11th out of 128 countries covered by the rankings. This country's economic success is no accident. For the entire period since Federation in 1901, investments have been protected by the same key principles that protect liberty: the presumption of innocence and equal treatment under a system of law that applies to everyone. And those ideas can be traced all the way back to Christian principles. Douglas Murray made a similar point in his 2017 book, The Strange Death of Europe. He argued that Western liberal societies may in fact owe something to the religion from which they arose. Which brings me to the collection of essays that has been assembled by Geoff Lindsay and Wayne Hudson. It seeks to open up discussion about the influence of Christian values on Australian law by focusing on 24 lawyers, judges, and public figures. They include Andrew Inglis Clark, who helped draft the Constitution, Gough Whitlam, Roma Mitchell, Robert Menzies, and Michael Kirby. Not all of them are lawyers, and some would not even describe themselves as Christians. Gough Whitlam, for example, once said he was no more than a fellow traveller. Eddie Mabo seems to have been alienated from the Christian church for years, blaming it for devaluing the culture and traditions of his people. That, however, provides a good indication of what this book is about. Mabo is included because of his profound influence on law and society. The first essay by former New South Wales Government Mari Bashir sets the tone. She argues that when Lachlan Macquarie was appointed governor in 1809, his example of tolerance and humanity marked the beginnings of the Australian tradition of the fair go, which she describes as the spirit of egalitarianism and fair play that many regard as the defining characteristic of most Australians. While this book claims to be merely the opening stage of a discussion and not the final word, these essays leave the reader with tangible evidence that is consistent with Sheridan's broad thesis. Christian values, as opposed to overt Christian theology, have been the makings of modern Australia. Patrick Kayser makes this explicit in his essay on Sir Gerard Brennan, the former Chief Justice of Australia. Kayser is now Dean of the Thomas More Law School and Professor of Law and Public Policy at the Australian Catholic University. But he was once Brennan's executive associate, and he has an unusually deep understanding of the judge and his judgments. He argues that when Brennan was on the High Court, he did not regard himself as having a commission to make Christian judgments, only orthodox judgments. Kayser recognises, however, that Christian thinking is evident in those judgments, particularly those concerning children, parenting and marriage, as well as bodily integrity and human dignity, as well as Aboriginal spirituality and religion. But there is a difference between a judgment that legitimately reflects Christian principles and one in which a judge allows personal religious belief to influence the outcome. Brennan, according to Kayser, would regard the latter as completely unthinkable. Michael Pelly, who apart from being a friend of mine, is legal editor at the Australian Financial Review, makes a similar point in his essay on Brennan's successor, Murray Gleeson, who once noted that effective laws have a moral foundation and religion had helped fill a void. Gleeson accepted that a judge's individual view should not be apparent in judgments, but he believed judges still have choices to make. How they interpret a statute, assess liability at common law, weigh competing rights, or sentence an offender will depend on precedent, but it will also be shaped by the judge's personal beliefs and experiences. One of the clearest expressions of this approach is in Arthur Emmett's powerful essay on Sir William Dean, a former High Court judge and Governor-General. Emmett, who was an acting Judge of Appeal in New South Wales, writes that Dean's Christian beliefs were implicit in his judgments. There were undeniable connections, according to Emmett, between his compassion for the disadvantaged and the vulnerable and the influences that came from his Christianity and commitment to the social justice teachings of the Christian Church, which emphasises the dignity of individuals, the importance of freedom from tyranny, the notion of the common good, and the right to private property. Emmett's essay destroys the myth that judges are mere technicians without agendas, even unconscious agendas of their own. He writes that judges of the High Court only hear those cases they consider to be fit for their attention, and that inevitably means those decisions will be influenced by their own personal beliefs and ethics. One of the recurring ideas in this book is the continuing impact of Christian principles as opposed to theology. In Dean's case, Emmett says it is clear that principles of Christian charity underlay his thinking. He favoured a rights-sensitive interpretation of the Constitution, including the development of a number of controversial implied constitutional rights that limit the power of governments. The broader debate about judicial method and the legitimacy of the implied rights jurisprudence is beyond the scope of this book. But for the sake of completeness, it needs to be made clear that judges are not free to make law as they see fit, even when motivated by Christian principles. Recent history has shown that departures from accepted judicial methods will inevitably incur criticism, even from the Chief Justice, Susan Kiefel. This is what happened last year when a bare majority of the High Court introduced a race-based exception to the Constitution's aliens power. That decision means Parliament's power to make laws with respect to aliens does not extend to those with Aboriginal ancestry, even if they are citizens of other countries, were not born in Australia, and have been convicted of crimes that would lead to the deportation of other foreigners. Excuse me. The discipline of orthodox judicial method means there is little chance of that Christian principles will send this country hurtling towards some sort of theocracy. Those principles have actually produced the reverse, a stable, secular state that has found room for other religions. The editors of this book have also pointed to another factor that needs to be considered when assessing the essays of 4 of the former High Court judges who appear in this book. The tenure of Brennan, Dean, Gleeson and Kirby coincided with an historically unique period following the commencement of the Australia Acts in 1986. These statutes marked the last step in Australia's legal independence from Britain and meant the law of this country would be considered afresh. To sum up, this collection of essays is a natural companion to Sheridan's earlier book on Christianity. Together, they point to a set of principles that have formed the framework for modern Australia. Fairness and equality before the law are fundamental, but so is the autonomy of the individual and the idea that government has a higher purpose than merely controlling the governed. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks very much, Chris. So we come to Geoff Lindsay. Geoff?
Thank you, Gerard. Thank you, Chris. Australian Jurists and Christianity is a collaborative effort of lawyers and historians, academics and legal practitioners. As editors, Wayne and I have endeavoured to ensure that there's a broad spread of interests and traditions represented in the book. The 24 essays in the book broadly follow the course of Australian history from Governor Lachlan Macquarie to the present. The object of the book is to illustrate by a series of biographical essays the influence of Christianity on the development of Australian law and society. The book is intended to open up for discussion the influence of Christianity on Australian law, not to conclude it. With two exceptions, all essay subjects are historical figures. The first exception relates to retired, still living judges of the High Court of Australia at a formative time for Australian law following enactment of the Australian Acts of 1986. So we have represented in the book Sir Gerard Brennan, Sir William Dean, Murray Gleeson and Michael Kirby. The second exception relates to the experience of an Attorney General representing, as it happens, the Orthodox tradition of Christianity, John Hatzisteros, now a District Court Judge. The essay relating to him surveys his experience in Parliament and as an Attorney General, not his judicial experience. An introduction and conclusion by the editors, Wayne and myself, provide an overview, firstly, of Australian legal history, distinguishing it from British and US experience, and touching upon the managerial society that we have become. There is also in the introduction and the conclusion a review of Australian religious thought, together with suggestions for further research. A measure of the novelty of the work is the foreword contributed by Emeritus Professor Bruce Kircher, one of the most, if not the most, senior and revered of Australian legal historians. The book is the Australian volume of an international series, Great Christian Jurists in National History. The general editor of the series is Professor John Whitty, Jr. of Emory University in Georgia in the USA. He is a much published author and editor, and as it happens, a protege of the late Professor Harold J. Berman, whose work may be known to some of our audience today. Berman was the author of Law and Revolution, the formation of the Western legal tradition, published in 2006. He was also the author of a collection of essays which I found particularly enlightening, called Faith and Order, The Reconciliation of Law and Religion, which was published in 1993. As an active member of the Francis Forbes Society for Australian Legal History, I was originally asked by John Whitty to edit a book of essays for Australia and New Zealand. After making some inquiries, I came to the view that, first of all, the volume should concentrate on Australia alone. There are sufficient differences between Australian and New Zealand law and society for them to be treated separately. And secondly, the book would benefit greatly from a co-editor with an academic interest in the history of ideas. Enter Wayne Hudson. He came to mind immediately when I saw his book, Australian Religious Thought, published by Monash University Press in 2016. In the concluding remarks of that book, Wayne drew attention to the need for there to be greater study of the relationship between Christianity and law. Wayne's contribution was indispensable in the preparation of the book and in any success it may have. Not apart from his experience and knowledge in the history of ideas, he was able to introduce me to a number of senior and respected historians. Also important in the book is Wayne's challenge to the distinction between religious and secular thought. In his book, Australian Religious Thought, he coined the expression sacral secularity. That expression, in summary terms, refers to a tendency which is evident in Australian society to associate the secular with sacral characteristics while acknowledging its relative autonomy from ecclesiastical control. My own favourite example of that is Anzac Day, which is celebrated by many Australians as a secular occasion, but it still has all the trappings of a liturgical tradition. Christian churches played a central role in establishing the Anzac Day tradition. Related to that is the experience of C.E.W. Bean, who was Australia's official war correspondent and war historian for the First World War. He, as much as anybody, promoted the idea of the Anzac tradition and mateship. Upon a study of Bean, it becomes apparent that what he described as the Anzac tradition was part of what he had earlier called the Arnold tradition. That was a 19th century liberal Anglo-Catholic mix of ideas, muscular Christianity, if you like, associated with Thomas Arnold of Rugby School. Few Australians make the connection between mateship and the Christian origins of the Arnold tradition, a matter of some fascination to me. The book focuses attention on topics traditionally at the intersection of spiritual and temporal concern: birth, death, marriage, charity, education, dignity and welfare of the individual. We sometimes overlook the traditional interest of Christianity in these topics, but for those of you who have experience of English legal history, you will recognise them as having a connection with the old ecclesiastical courts through whom the Supreme Court of New South Wales derived some of its jurisdiction. I was very interested to hear the address of Chris, and on the whole, I would say his assessment of the book accords very much with my own. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Geoff Lindsay, and thanks for sticking to, both our speakers have stuck to their time, a bit under, which is great. So Wayne Hudson.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we're right.
Good.
Yep.
Right. Okay, thank you. Thank you, everybody. I normally, in contexts like this, I normally say some very controversial things and have the audience in fits of laughter, but that didn't seem the right thing to do tonight. So I'm reading you a more sober text with a view to the legal training of most of our audience. Australian history is a relatively young subject. Most of the older historiography was British imperialist, Eurocentric and or white nationalist. Recently, more attention has been paid to Indigenous history, Australian, Asian history, the role of women, and environmental history. A more inclusive multicultural bias has replaced some of the conventions derived from British constitutional history. Australian historians have also changed. Younger Australian historians are more sensitive than I certainly was to the negative parts of the national story. But then Australian lawyers have changed as well. I won't go through all of that now, but they are much less imperial than they once were, and they probably know less about British constitutional and political and social history than they once did. In this context, it's not easy to integrate the new Australian history with the new Australian legal history, which is more intellectually informed than it once was, and certainly more than it was when I studied it. Many Australian historians know quite little about the law, while not all practicing lawyers, for obvious reasons, can be up to date with the latest historical research. So a major problem for the book, but I think part of its strength, is bringing historians and lawyers together. around contemporary agendas that are important for our country and its future. Australian Jurists and Christianity opens up, as Geoff has said, a discussion about Christianity and law in the new situation. It does not demonstrate, as has also been noted, that the religious thought of the jurists was decisive. And that's because we're often uncertain quite what the religious thought really was. We might ask, for example, what did a particular jurist know about Schleiermacher or Cardinal Newman or Karl Barth? In most cases, we don't know. But on the other hand, there is in the book overwhelming evidence for the importance of quiet Christianity. And that opens up the theme that has already been raised of how the moral sensitivity and integrity of the jurists has Christian origins and Christian influences, almost regardless of their views. I wouldn't suggest that an atheist jurist was less Christian than a Catholic or an evangelical jurist or a Jewish jurist. The influence in Australia is not by your religious connection, but by how the moral imagination works. Australian Jurists and Christianity also provides, as Geoff has said, support for the concept of sacred secularity. And I want to stress that a little bit because it's not well known to Australian lawyers and it's important for their work. Because if we begin to question any absolute dualism between religion and the secular, all kinds of questions take on a different shape. Now, in this respect, this book is at the global front, and that's not well recognized in some of the reviews because the people writing them are not at the global front. Sacred secularity is a sub-theme of the post-secular turn, a phrase that you will know, but if you don't know, please write it down, the post-secular turn, which is a major turn in contemporary political thought, but not much noted in Australian policy discussion. But it's of enormous importance to Australia and its future in the new Asia. It's extremely important for understanding contemporary America and its bizarre politics, for understanding the Islamic world, particularly our nearest neighbor, Indonesia, and for understanding the state theology, which this week is even more important, of President Xi. So this is not just a little nudge to catch up with aspects of Australian religious thought. It's a clear statement that we've got the nature of the secular and the religion often wrong in political debates, and it's hurting us internationally because we can't really understand the Islamic world, contemporary China, and I fear much of the time, the United States. Australian Jurists and Christianity is a significant contribution, I'm prepared to say, to the understanding of the distinctiveness of the Australian experience. And I want to underline that because Australia is a country that doesn't know why it's different. And as Geoff was also hinting, we iterate the difference and we don't know where the difference came from. Now we've got to get over that or we're going to get our future history in Asia wrong. The introduction of the book, which is largely Geoff, is in my view quite outstanding and should be published in another format where a wider public can see it, because he does define some of the characteristics of the Australian legal order. And he gives a very subtle sense of how Christianity played a role in it. I would also like to thank all the contributors to the book and also the press. And then I'd like to say something finally about how a better approach to Australian historical writing and a better approach to legal history come together. And I think this book signals the sort of thing that we need to start to explore. That's my final, but perhaps most important point. We need to think about Australian legal history and Australian general history in another way, because we need to understand how Christianity shaped the secular here. And it's not Christianity in a big abstract sense. It's lots of sorts of Christianity that were really very quarrelsome and cantankerous and fighting with each other. And they shape it at different points and in different ways. I don't entirely agree with what Greg Sheridan says, although I admire the book, because I think as an historian, I need sharper distinctions and more precise nuance, as you as lawyers would feel in a legal discussion. Now, rectifying the record of our country so that we understand why it's distinctive and how it's distinctive, I think goes to the whole question of how we reinvent ourselves as a multicultural nation. Australians are currently trying to do that, but I think they're doing it in many ways in the wrong way. They're trying to redo 18th century German nationalism. Well, I'm sorry, but it's too late. And they're ignoring the most important political development in the contemporary world, which is the return of the civilizational state. Now, the civilizational state has returned in Russia, and I've done a lot of work with the Russian church and Russian political people. In India, where you see Modi has essentially left the secularist paradigm. In China, where we now have a state theology that every child will learn in primary school. And in Turkey, which has not only moved away from Ataturk, but which is now conducting a kind of global Islamic Turkic empire all the way to China. And that's on the web if you're interested in contemporary Turkish affairs. None of this is really profiled in Australian discussions. When Australians talk about China or Indonesia, they talk in ways that are totally out of date, that don't reflect the discussion in those countries, and it largely is in terms that ignore the language. Who have you heard talking about China except Rudd, who has enough language to make the distinctions? And the same is true of Indonesia, and the same is true, I think, of the United States. That's more controversial. So, in my view, a deeper understanding of the role of Christianity and law in explaining the distinctiveness of Australia is of very great importance. Australian jurists and Christianity, I believe, begins some of the work we need to do. It is not a political work, but the truthfulness and objectivity to which it aspires has political implications of the first importance. And it is those virtues which are so lacking in Australia in so many contexts at the moment. But those virtues, I believe, are crucial for our future in this century. I'm very proud to be associated with this book.
Many thanks, Wayne Hudson. So Anne Henderson.
Well, it's great to be participating in this much delayed discussion. The book itself has been a long time in its gestation. But when I was asked to contribute a chapter on Robert Menzies as a jurist and Christian by Geoff, I jumped at the chance. Because so much of looking back on Robert Menzies is about his fine achievements as a politician. And it'll be a long time, if ever, that another politician will match his longevity as Prime Minister or erudite mind in the job. Even Menzies' remarkable performance as a young barrister in what has become labelled the engineer's case, standing before the learned minds of Australia's High Court on the 24th of May 1920, has faded in the wake of Menzies' life as Australia's longest-serving Prime Minister. On that day in May 1920, aged just 25, Menzies showed off a capacity and temerity gained from resisting opponents from a very young age. In his argument before Mr. Justice Stark, Menzies tried to demonstrate the weaknesses that had developed over time in law relating to state and federal powers in matters of industrial relations. For an hour or more, he argued complicated semantics in an attempt to prove his client, a state-run sawmill in Western Australia, was justified in bringing its employees under a federal award. To do this, he was attempting to argue that the function of such enterprises was of trading, not of government. Listening, Mr. Justice Stark had lost patience, saying, "This argument is a lot of nonsense." And to the surprise of many in the court, the determined young Menzies replied, "Sir, I quite agree." Then this led to an adjournment and a rehearing weeks later, where the High Court found in favour of Menzies' client, and a decision which would make constitutional history. In his first appearance before the High Court, Menzies had shown a boldness which he later admitted the older Menzies would not have dared display. But he also, however, sealed his reputation as a jurist. In so much of his personal and professional life, the ways of the barrister defined Robert Menzies. From his quick-witted repartee, taking no prisoners, to his command of constitutional arguments, Menzies strode above his opponents. At times, in his early years, a bit too far above them, as his early political flaws demonstrated. He was most at ease among the legal alumni, whether at his office in the distinguished Selborne Chambers in Melbourne, or as an honorary master at London's Gray's Inn, where in a dinner speech to honour Sir Winston Churchill in 1953, Menzies spoke of his being a very humble servitor in the great tradition of the law. In his post-retirement book, Afternoon Light, Some Memories of Men and Events, Menzies also admitted that the practice of the law in court was and remains my first love. Born in December 1894, Robert Menzies was reared in a family of staunch Presbyterian faith. As a boy in his grandmother's care, punishments were meted out that required learning by heart long passages of the Bible, from which Heather Menzies deduced her father must have been quite naughty, as he could quote at length from biblical texts. In a speech in 1960, Menzies referred to himself as, quote, an unblushing Presbyterian. He belonged to an era in Australia that was inseparable from Christianity, certainly of the Sunday observance kind. His daughter Heather, however, is somewhat circumspect as to Menzies' particular sense of Christian observance, recalling that when at church at St Andrews in Canberra, her father's chief absorption was working out how the Reverend Hector Harrison was going to get from the beginning to the end of his sermon. Such was his tendency to dart about as he preached. Menzies and his family's Presbyterian faith, unlike that of his immediate prime ministerial predecessor, Catholic Joe Lyons, was steeped in the God, King and country traditions of the UK, evolving as it had done from the Church of Scotland and the Acts of Union, which created the Kingdom of Great Britain. It was a church of representative assemblies rather than the hierarchical style of ancient Catholicism. Representative government under British Westminster traditions was an article of faith for Robert Menzies, inspired not simply by biblical teachings, but also from the evolving freedoms and rights granted to individuals and citizens under English law. For Menzies, Christianity and the law were thus bound together under the English crown. For more years than he was Prime Minister, Menzies' life was centred on the law. As a barrister, Attorney General, both state and federal, and as writer of essays on constitutional law. Constitutional law became a personal fascination for Menzies and underpinned much of his perspective as a political leader. Lecturing at the University of Virginia in 1967, he told his audience, "I propose to speak not as a lawyer addressing his betters in the academic field, but as a lawyer politician who had the chief responsibility for the national government in its dealings with the states for almost 30% of the life of the Commonwealth of Australia." As a federalist and lawyer, Menzies' approach to reform was of the evolutionary kind rather than revolutionary sort. He saw the constant tension between state authority and federal authority as a healthy tension. It protected rights and enabled argument and good governance to prevail. Menzies' trust in the British Westminster system and the British lawmaking and its history made his faith strong in his belief in the traditions of Gray's Inn, of the founding fathers of the Australian Constitution, and of, as he put it in one of his speeches, the great English-speaking alliance around the world. This he saw as the, quote, greatest contribution that the English genius has made so far in the history of the world. These pillars of Menzies' life as barrister, politician and ordinary citizen represented not only the secular world, but emanated from the Judeo-Christian foundations on which those institutions were built. In a radio broadcast in 1946 on Christianity and communism, Menzies argued that Christianity was a faith of love, while communism was one of hate, opining, quote, "For all Christians, the cross, after 1900 years, remains the symbol of the freely accepted sacrifice for others." For Menzies, that Judeo-Christian influence underpinned the values his world passed on to future generations. In a radio broadcast in February 1943, Menzies considered the importance of education from preschool to university, education to produce critical minds in a democratic society. He spoke of the need in the post-war world to, quote, "spend far more millions than we have ever dreamed of spending on education." He then added that he feared church schools would not be able to continue without some state assistance in such circumstances. Menzies' support for church schools was unequivocal. He praised those parents who paid to have their children educated in non-government schools, as people who believed that education divorced from religion not only is incomplete, but may actually be dangerous. Within 2 decades, his own government would begin Australia's financial support for non-government schools. Menzies regarded his strengthening of the university system as his enduring legacy. He set up the Murray Inquiry into universities, which led in time to the Commonwealth taking over full responsibility for universities and advanced education. In November 1963, Menzies also announced grants for the construction of science blocks in non-government schools and began the move towards significant state funding of what he called church schools. In his professional achievements, his writings and speeches, Robert Menzies was a leader whose legalistic and political successes were underpinned by timeless principles guiding Western democracies, at the apex of which he believed was the Westminster system with its political and legal freedoms linked to fundamental Christian traditions. Thank you.
So thanks, Anne. So thanks to Chris and Geoff and Wayne and Anne. Now, as you know, we're here tonight on the occasion of the launch by Chris Merritt of Australian Jurists in Christianity by the Federation Press, which is available, but in these days of pandemic, I'm not sure where, but I'm sure it's selling online. And at any rate, we can arrange for you to get a copy if you so wish. So now we come to questions and discussion. As I said before, give the hand signal if you want to come in, and we have Nick in Newcastle and Naomi down here helping us on the technical side. So can I just start off? It was mentioned by Chris, I think, that there are, is it 3 Chief Justices or 4? We've got chapters in this book. I think it's 4.
Yeah.
Now, what about a couple of other Chief Justices? What about, who obviously don't fit into the book, but how would they have approached their roles differently? I'm talking about a Jew like Isaac, or an atheist like John Latham. How would they have been different from the ones we've discussed? Or would they not have been different? Let's start with Chris.
I don't think there'd be, the point of distinction would not be about their religion. It would be more their judicial method, I would imagine. That this might change over time. Early Chief Justices might have taken a more cognizance, if you like, of Christian values, including Isaac Isaacs. He was part of the legal establishment at the time. His religion, I doubt, would have played any role at all on the way he applied the law. What concerns me a little bit is that there is now a clear anti-religion movement, particularly an anti-Christian movement afoot in society. And I worry that if that is given too much credence or finds too many adherents, that it could infect the standing, if you like, of the principles, Christian principles that underpin where we are today. And I say that not from a Christian point of view, but from a legal point of view. I think that the Australian law needs an underpinning of principle and morality, and this is the framework that we've developed and we have, and I think it would be dangerous and cause too much dislocation to move away from that at this point in our development.
Thanks, Chris. Geoff, do you want to say anything on that? Or Wayne? Or Anne?
Well, I'd be particularly interested in Wayne's comments. It seems to me that there is a long tradition amongst Australian lawyers, senior lawyers, of thinking of law as a wholly separate discipline. That, I think, goes back quite some time, and you see it in our more modern High Court judges as well, I think. The key point ultimately is that it's not merely the letter of the law that counts, but the spirit of the law. The spirit of the law in our tradition has been largely Judeo-Christian, but there are other traditions which equally find a necessity for something beyond the written word. Thank you.
I was trying to make exactly the point Chris has made in raising the question of the civilizational state, because modern Australians are inclined to think you can have a society with a few rules and then the rest of it, individuals will decide for themselves. And that's a sociological nonsense for reasons we can go into, but it's also very bad history, because the whole point about the civilizational state is that successful historical organizations inculcate in some way moral values and ideals into their populations. And if you give them nothing, then you're just going to get the digital garbage flowing into kids, as is largely happening at the moment. Look at the amount of pornography young Australian kids get to see.
Come in there. And
Sorry, well, the only exception to our Judeo-Christian Westminster system that's come up in recent times has been Britain's move to recognise, in some cases, Sharia law. And I think that's an interesting one for jurists. In what sense does it change the way we see our own legal system?
okay, so we're just going, if you want to join in, put your hand up or use the hand function. I think we're going to go to Lindsay Ellison. Lindsay?
Thanks, Gerard. I thank the speakers. Perhaps a question to Justice Lindsay. The book deals with both politicians and judges, and politicians seem to be fair game with regard to their faith, and the examples come to hand of Scott Morrison and refugee policy and Pentecostal faith, and Tony Abbott and abortion policy and his Catholic beliefs. But politicians are, to some extent, expected to implement their philosophy and their beliefs such as we know them. We don't have confirmation hearings. We know very little about the faith of people appointed as judges. But what does the research show how individual judges apply their faith, such as it might be, to coming to a decision, especially when very rarely in a judgment is there any reference to the scriptures or to faith guiding the decision-making process?
Well, I can't say what the most recent research really shows, but the most instructive essay, I think, in this book on that topic is Arthur Emmett's essay on Bill Dean. You probably find that most lawyers and judges, at least consciously, subordinate their religious or social beliefs, at least in their own mind, when they attach themselves to legal questions. But this is an area that has not really been very much explored. If you go to the preface to the book, you'll see that pretty much the same thing is said by Bruce Kircher about 19th century judges in colonial New South Wales. Any research on this topic is probably best conducted historically, because it's not until the passing of a career that you're able to analyse everything. But I'd suggest you read the Arthur Emmett essay on Bill Dean.
Brian Lucas. Brian.
Thanks very much, Gerard. Several of the essayists make the point that their subject was able to apply the law in a way that didn't explicitly draw on Christian principles, but drew on an innate sense of morality and social conscience. And I was particularly struck with Susan McGarry's comment on Dame Roma Mitchell, that she was profoundly religious, but not doctrinaire. My question is, to what extent can one separate one's explicit Christian affiliation from that broad social conscience and sense of morality?
Who's going to respond to that? I think we probably We may go to Wayne. Wayne?
Well, you know, one of the things we're trying to say in the book is that's the distinction you can't draw. And it's true both ways. So on the one hand, the social morality is already formed, as Anne was saying, through the Christian history. It isn't a morality that is accepted in all cultures in all parts of the world. If you have a society with a radically different worldview, they won't have those values. The Aztecs did not have our sense of social morality, to put it very clearly. And on the other hand, it's important to see that the Christian material is not free of social influence. Because whenever you find Christianity, it's been enculturated in a particular culture, and it takes on a certain distorted form from the language and the values of the people that you're dealing with. So we mustn't have this dualism. One of the things the book is trying to show is that that's the wrong way of understanding how the two things influence each other. As in a lot of sociology, there are two variables and they interact, but they're not separate.
Does everyone else of our speakers want to join in there?
One of the things that makes me about Australian society is that sometimes even the most religious of people will say, I am not religious, and they're taken at face value. There is something about a church institution that makes people hesitate, and they don't want to seem enthusiastic, but that does not mean that they are not very much affected by their Christian heritage.
Okay, so we go to Frank and then Robin Fitzsimons. Frank?
Gerard, a question I think for Anne. Your first speaker and I talked about the fact that property could not be just was cared for. It couldn't be taken by control of the government without compensation. The problem I have discovered in the last few weeks under COVID is that the right to income, the right to make a living, can be taken without compensation. And I wonder where that fits in with all of this.
You got the tough question, Anne.
That's a question for me.
You know both sides, you know the lawyers and you know the police answer.
Well, every case, it's merits. I don't know what you're talking about to start with.
Well, I can give you an idea. You see, the question I think is, what would Bob Menzies have said about all this? That's the question.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah.
Well, I can't ask him. The times are very different. What Bob Menzies might have thought about the Republic, I don't know. And there were some whispers from people who are doing very well at the time we were having the debate at the end of last century that he might have voted for a Republic. But if you read everything he ever said, he was very much the Queen's man. So what can you say about what Robert Menzies might say? Look, as everybody knows, the law's an evolving, very fluid thing. It's about the principles. As for taking property, I don't know what the case is about. There is a big debate going on right now, and I think it's a very healthy one, about how much our rights can be invaded by a national crisis. If you look at COVID, there'll be one side of the argument saying that it's such a disaster that we must, as in a war, we give over certain powers to our central government or our state government or whatever. Other sides say this is an invasion of our rights and we're living under some sort of Gestapo, whatever. In the middle of it all, we're all just trying to get through. I'm sure once we get back to something that we used to regard as normal, it will all sort itself out. None of the powers that I can see being used at the moment are permanent. And I'm sure that in this wonderful democratic republic or non-republic constitutional setup, we will find a way to let our leaders know that we don't want to live under something that is unjust. So I can't answer your question specifically. I don't know what the case is about, but I do know that we're having a very healthy debate right now about whether we're undergoing too much pressure from government and whether it's a crisis that requires the kind of handover to government of powers such as in a war. Is it? I'm only one voice.
Good answer. Thank you.
Thank you.
Perhaps I could add that I think
here we go, we're right. So we're going to Robin, okay?
Okay.
Robin.
Thank you. If I understand correctly or have understood things correctly over the years, lawyers or judges may bring the values, Christian values, or at any rate values, to their interpretation of the law, but it cannot override, they cannot override the law. So my question is, what evidence is there from the various jurists who have been studied in this book of how they might in different ways have handled discomfiture about having to apply law which is to some degree at fundamental variance with those values which they hold personally?
Well, I think the most explicit treatment of that topic is the essay on John Hatzistergos, because as a member of the Orthodox tradition in Parliament, he had to deal with issues that were uncongenial to his co-religionists, and he had to deal with everything in the public square. So that's probably the most explicit treatment of that particular topic. But the nature of law is changing, and it has been changing for some years. I'm not sure that any of us have really caught up with it. We used to talk about rights and obligations which were largely determined by juries, but we have done away with juries in civil proceedings and in large measure in criminal proceedings. So there has emerged something of a managerial society where management decisions are made. That's very consistent with the equity jurisdiction over time, but it's permeated all of our law. And what we're seeing at the moment in relation to COVID is simply, on one view, an illustration of the managerial society. And the key to our freedoms, if you like, in that way of thinking of things, is to focus on the purpose of any management decisions. And it's important, I think, for the law to learn to keep everything under check by focusing on the purpose. Why is this being done? What purpose does it serve? Thank you.
We go to Ida Lichter. Ida. So we go to
thank you.
Ida, right?
Yeah, thank you to all the speakers. Regarding what you mentioned as waning Christian influence, would Christianity have a stronger moral position globally if the Western churches mobilized firmly on behalf of persecuted Christians in the Middle East?
Who wants to lead on that one? Wayne, you can have a go at that.
Oh dear, that's a very complex question, isn't it? Obviously, the churches have not done very well with the problem of persecuted Christians in the Middle East, but they didn't do very well with them at various stages before as well. It's a long history, this, of neglect and misunderstanding. And one of the problems, I think, in Australia is that when we talk about Christianity, we largely seem to mean British and American Christianity, and on a good day, Western Europe. But of course, the Eastern churches don't appear prominently in our thinking. And I've never really seen a discussion in Australia by a legal author of the Eastern rites of the Catholic Church. And enormous numbers of Australian Catholics don't even know that there are 8 to 10 Eastern rites with married clergy and neo-Orthodox liturgy and neo-Orthodox theology. So part of the problem is to see the problem in the Middle East, we have to know about the Middle East. And Christians these days in the West tend not to know about it. They know very little about Christianity itself historically, and they know very little of it in Europe. If you ask this panel to talk about Christianity in Belarus, I don't think you'll get more than 10 minutes. I'd include myself in that. So the problem really is that the Christians have not successfully grasped the diversity of the world and their presence across so much of it. It's not only the Middle East, the same story can be given for China, it can be given for contemporary India, it can be given for Indonesia. There are enormous numbers of Christians in Indonesia. Now, very few Australians actually know that. So the problem is that the Christians are not across the data. I agree with you that the moral response is very inadequate. But the way forward in these things is not always to say to them, be more moral, but to say to them, be more moral once you're more informed.
Want to make a comment on that? Okay, so we go to Sophie York. I think we go into Sophie York. Yes, there she is.
Muting. Oh, I'm listening to all this. I can't wait to read the book. It sounds wonderful, Gerard, and hi, Anne, as well. Hi, everyone who's on the call. This is a bit of a favourite topic of mine. As some of you know, I lecture in jurisprudence and also legal ethics, and it's an interest of mine to ensure that we don't lose the great legacy and heritage of our Judeo-Christian society. And I do think that because there is a lack of knowledge about it, it's not being taught. There's an overemphasis on some of the flaws in it, and yet every system in every nation's history has flaws in it, that they're not being taught about the gems in our history. And so they don't know that the yield of it, which we all enjoy, we have one of the best countries in the world, is so magnificent. There's such a respect for the individual, and there's such a forgiving attitude and a redemptive approach in our tort system, our criminal system. It's a very fair-minded approach in law, in all the areas of law, succession, torts, contracts, you name it. So I would hate us to lose that simply because successive generations haven't been taught about that or don't make the connection. They think that all punitive regimes across the world are just as fair-minded and reasonable as Australia's, and so forth. So I'm just very conscious at the moment that some of the principles that we have, so an individual has the right to consent freely, to move about, to speak, have thoughts, procreate, own private property, express dissent with the ruling authorities, that all those principles that are hard won and long-standing are being actually ejected right now. I'm very, very concerned about that. So,
no, Geoff, that's considerable praise for your book. Can you give us a judgment on that?
I think I'll have to defer to Lindsay Ellison.
Maybe Chris.
Chris, can you give it? Well, Chris is not a judge, but Chris, can you give an opinion on that?
Sure, he can give an opinion.
Well, yeah.
Look, I'm very interested in Sophie's remarks. I think she's hit the nail on the head, and I think what we're facing, if I just refer to the pandemic, I think what we're facing is the consequence of a very public democratic deficit. We're seeing unelected officials making pronouncements on what you can do, what you can't do, when you can leave your home, how far you can travel. Sometimes it's backed up by premiers who make these statements. I'd like to see, if this is going to be a permanent state of affairs, and that's how it looks, I think what we need to do is ensure that the democratic norms that have got us to where we are come with us, that we don't simply leave those things behind and somehow accept the current arrangements, which are regardless of the motivation, they send exactly the wrong signal to a large part of society. And if you want proof of that, you've just got to see all the unfortunate people who think it was a good idea to go to the beach on a sunny day and have demonstrations in defiance of orders to stay away. There's a growing defiance of instructions that don't clearly have the appearance of democratic legitimacy. And the answer is not simply to wag the finger at all these horrible people, but the answer lies in adjusting the mechanisms that we have on display so that people can have confidence that we're bringing democratic norms with us, that they're not being left behind.
And not prorogue Parliament.
So we're coming to the end now. So I just thought I'd run around in reverse order from the people who spoke. You've all written chapters in this book, and other people have written chapters as well, but talking about the three of you and Chris who's launched the book and obviously read it. To what, and it's based on a concept of legal law and Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity, as some of you have said. Is Australia still a Judeo-Christian country the way it was when let's say around the turn of the century, some of these judges you start talking about, like Victor Windeyer and others, 120 years ago, we're still a Judeo-Christian society or not? And let's start with you.
Well, clearly a very different society from 100 years ago. We're a multicultural society, but what I find fascinating about those who've come from very different backgrounds from our immigration groups, say going even to pre-Second World War, and even some of the immediate post-Second World War, is we've taken in people that have come from very different legalistic backgrounds, if you think of the Middle East, if you think of Asia Pacific. And yet what I'm heartened by is that having made the transition to very different kind of world order, set of principles in society, largely there is no conflict in those who come as newcomers to settle and bring their children up. This may be because of what they're running from. And strangely, that central focus on the Crown and Westminster of Robert Menzies, what I find with, and I'm a Republican, I find the greatest resistance to getting rid of that Westminster tradition around the Crown of Great Britain is strongest in many of our newcomers and immigrants. Some of my friends going back to post-war from communist countries in the east of Europe, right through to people who've come from dictatorships or difficult places in Southeast Asia, they actually find that Westminster tradition, that Judeo-Christian tradition, which is not religious so much as cultural, are very comforting. So I think we're still on track. And as others have said before, we are different from where we've come from, and we do need to embrace that. Our problem is defining it. And maybe that's our genius. We don't have a rigid definition. We're very fluid. We're an organic mass, but I'm an optimist for that moment.
Thanks, Wayne.
I agree entirely with what Anne said. I think that's exactly right. And I think it's very important that people who've suffered all over the world, whether it be from communism or from fascism or from cruel, fanatical regimes, they come to Australia and they bond immediately and they bond deeply. And I think they actually teach us a better theology than our clergy have been able to teach us yet. They teach us that the real theology is in the life, and you can see it when it's in the life. And that's about as Jesus of Nazareth as you can get. When it's in the life, people can see it. And we have to think in the theological sphere in a totally new way. Francis is trying to push the Roman Church in that direction now. We have to see the theology not as mysteries that occur when the sacerdotal clergy are active, but what happens in the real lives of people. And if it's not there, it won't survive. But insofar as it is there, I think Australia is on the edge of beginning to realise that its distinctiveness includes a strong sacral element. It's happened with Aborigines. No one in Australia makes fun of Aboriginal spirituality anymore. All right, they make fun, Chris is right, of Christians. But that's because Christians are not radiating in the life the truth that all can see. And if it's really in the life, people will see it.
Thanks, Wayne. Geoff?
Well, I doubt whether we were ever in any real sense a Christian country, though Christian influence is always there. I think with these sorts of labels, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. The real problem, perhaps for Australia, certainly for Christianity today, is to make sure that it's part of the conversation and responding to the needs of society through faith.
Thanks, Geoff. Final comment, Chris?
Look, I think it gets down to a question of self-confidence. From personal experience, when my father came to this country in 1950, he couldn't wait to become as Australian as possible. And I've seen that with recent immigrants. This overemphasis on cultural equivalence and accommodating the imagined desires of new arrivals to bring with them their cultures from their countries of origin. I think it's overplayed a little bit. People come to this country for a reason, and it's pretty obvious what that reason is. We've got the huge advantage of never having had an established church. while simultaneously having the genius of the Westminster system of government. Like Anne, in my heart, I'm a Republican, but in my head, I know that there's no better system of government than that of Westminster. And it's something to be proud of. And we need to be a little bit more self-confident about what we've got in this country. That's how we defend it, not by obsequiously seeking to accommodate the imagined desires of new arrivals. They're here for a reason. They want to be Australian.
Many thanks, Chris, and thanks for launching this. So, as I said, we're here on the occasion of the launch. Australian Jurists and Christianity, published by the Federation Press, edited by two of our speakers tonight, Geoff Lindsay and Wayne Hudson, with an essay by Anne Henderson, and launching comments we're very grateful for by Chris Merritt. It's a book that starts with a look at Lachlan Macquarie, born in 1761, down to John Hastistikos, born in 1960. So there's quite a lot of ground covered there. So many thanks to our four speakers tonight, and thanks for joining in, and we'll see you again next time. Thanks.
Can I just add an advertisement? I have a small number of books that I can sell you for half price because I got them at the author discount. So I'll be sending out an ad if anyone would like to imbibe.
Would love one, Anne.
Thank you. Anything else you want to flog, Anne? Me? Thanks a lot, folks.
Thank you so much,
Thank you.
Hendersons. Thanks,
Okay.
everyone.
Thanks, guys.
All the best.
Bye all.